Imperial Navy battleship Yamato. All aircraft in attack formation. First bombing run, begins. Launch away.
If the Pacific War is remembered for one thing at all, it is its lack of battleship combat. Early in the conflict, the supremacy of aircraft carriers had been demonstrated, and throughout the conflict, this supremacy remained. Both the IJN and the US Navy had spent the interwar period refining their battleship tactics to the very edge of perfection, only for them to end up playing second-hand to the aircraft carriers. Through the course of the Pacific War, battleships were relegated to second-line duties of carrier escort and shore bombardment. The great naval gunfights that they were designed for were few and far between. In contrast to the other theaters of World War II, battleships only fired on enemy surface ships 6 times during the Pacific War, and almost all of the battleships that participated in these actions never saw surface combat again. A good example of this is the battleship Yamato, which was specifically designed to slug it out with other battleships, but only ever engaged destroyers and escort ships in surface combat. However, in stark contrast to this rule is the Japanese battleship Kirishima. During her short wartime career, she participated in no less than 3 service actions, and ultimately she would meet her fate during one. This is the story of how a ship long considered obsolete managed to push ahead of her more modern opposition and come out on top, dueling against enemies many times her size. This is the story of Kirishima, the IJN's gunfighter. Hey y'all. So before we start, this is the first video on my channel, and any support you can give would be absolutely phenomenal. If you enjoyed the video, leave a quick like and maybe even subscribe. Any support that this channel gets will go a long way, and I'd really appreciate it. Anyway, I don't want to waste your time much longer, so yeah, back to the video. The year 1906 marked a turning point in naval history, as the British Royal Navy commissioned the world's first modern battleship, HMS Dreadnought, a ship that revolutionized battleship design with its armament of all big guns, and immediately rendered all other battleships obsolete. Just a year later, in 1907, another milestone was reached. The armored cruiser, previously essential to most powerful navies in the world, was rendered almost entirely ineffective by the launch of the British HMS Invincible, a ship that combined the big guns of a battleship with the speed of a light cruiser. Invincible could easily run down and sink any armored cruiser that she encountered, and she was designed to do so. Together with Dreadnought, they revolutionized naval combat and threw a wrench into the plans of other navies worldwide, most notably Japan. In the aftermath of their stunning defeat of the Russians in 1905, Japan began looking to expand their navy. Experiences during the war had shown the benefits of having a large battle fleet, and in 1907, the so-called Imperial Defense Policy was adopted, a policy that called for Japan to always have 8 modern battleships and 8 modern armored cruisers in their navy at all times. Thus, they could effectively maintain relative parity with the United States Pacific Fleet. The policy eventually became to be known as the 8-8 Fleet Plan, and formed the backbone of Japanese naval ambitions. However, it was not hard for issues with the plan to be found, namely the rapid technological developments that continued to render ships obsolete before they even entered the water. By the time of the plan's proper implementation in 1910, the 8 required armored cruisers had been replaced by much more powerful battle cruisers, and the 8 battleships had become larger, and by virtue much more expensive. The first serious attempt to begin the plan's fulfillment began in 1910, when the Navy began the construction of 5 modern capital ships, 1 battleship, the Fuso, and 4 battlecruisers of what would become the Congo class. Congo was laid down first, overseas in Great Britain, since Japan lacked the experience in building capital ships of such a size. As a result, she was the first of the class to complete, coming in 1913, with the rest being laid down in Japan. Experiences with building Congo greatly helped in the building of the next 3, and all were launched and fitting out by December of that same year. The ships were, in order, Congo, Hiei, Kirishima, and Haruna, and upon completion they were considered to be the most powerful battlecruisers in existence, a title that they would arguably hold until the commissioning of HMS Hood in 1920. The specifications of the Congo class were nothing short of staggering. Their sleek hull form and 704-foot length gave them the ability to reach the, at the time, staggering speed of 27.5 knots, a speed that they reached on 64,000 shaft horsepower through 4 shafts. Along with this high speed, the ships were incredibly well armed. Instead of opting for the standard 12-inch main armament of the time, the Japanese opted to equip them with the much newer 14-inch weapon, which fired a shell nearly 700 pounds heavier. The Congos were armed with 8 of these new weapons, which gave them the ability to fire a broadside, equaling the weight of nearly 12,000 pounds, power that would not be matched on a battlecruiser until the commissioning of HMS Renown in 1916. The heavy guns were backed up by a total of 16 6-inch guns, fitted in casemate mountings on both sides of the hull. In addition, Congo was also fitted with 8 21-inch submerged torpedo tubes, with 4 of them on each broadside. The hull that carried these weapons was well protected, with a full 8 inches of armor protecting her vitals low in the hull, which gradually thinned to 6 inches farther up, with her gun turrets and conning tower being protected with 10 and 9 inches of armor respectively. Although well equipped for her designed role of hunting armored cruisers, this armor wasn't sufficient to stand up to the guns found on modern battleships, which would have no trouble whatsoever in penetrating it. However, like all battlecruisers, the trade-off for weaker armor was that more space and weight could be dedicated to the machinery spaces, thus giving them unparalleled speed advantages over their battleship counterparts. The closest contemporary battleship to the Congos, HMS Erin, sailed through the water at a speed of only 21 knots. The Congos, with their more extensive propulsion systems, blew her out of the water at a speed of 27.5. It was this speed that made the Congos truly useful to Japan beyond anything else, as they were incredibly useful for detached operations and could act as useful scouts for the Japanese battle fleet. As a result, Japan would order 4 of them: Kongo, Hiei, Haruna, and this story's hero, Kirishima. On the 17th of March 1912, the ship that would become Kirishima was laid down at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki. She was the 4th and last ship laid down for the Kongo class, with her sister Haruna being laid down only a day earlier on the 16th. Despite this, Kirishima was actually launched 13 days earlier than Haruna was, formally entering the water on the 1st of December 1913. Fitting out proceeded steadily for both ships, and remarkably, both Kirishima and Haruna were commissioned into the Japanese Navy on the same day, 19th of April 1915. Both ships were promptly incorporated into the IJN and were assigned to the 1st Battleship Division as part of the 1st Fleet. However, neither were as of yet fully effective combat units, as like any good ship, they and their crews needed to be worked up and trained. As a result, Kirishima would spend her first 7 months running trials in Japan's inland sea. Kinks in the ship's construction were worked out, her crew was trained, and Kirishima became more than ready to sail into combat. The problem was, at this point, there was no combat to be had. The First World War had already been raging for over a year, and naval threats in the Pacific were almost non-existent. The German naval port of Tsingtao in China had already been dealt with by a combined land and naval assault, and the German East Asia Squadron, whilst attempting to escape back to Germany, had been eradicated in a series of battles around South America. With no naval threat left in the Pacific, there was nothing for Kirishima to do but to patrol areas of Japanese interest in the East China Sea and to continue to go on training missions. Despite attempts by the British to get Japan to lend them the Congos for service in the Grand Fleet, Kirishima would end up finishing the war without ever having fired her guns in anger, and had never even seen the enemy. After the end of World War I, there became even less to do for the Japanese Navy. With no enemy to fight and no reason to continue having ships mobilized for combat, Japan's battle fleet remained in port or on fleet maneuvers. However, even with the end of hostilities, Japan was still looking to strengthen their navy, and reach the ever-elusive goal of 8 battleships and 8 battle cruisers. During the war, Japan had commissioned 4 new battleships, 2 of the Fuso class, Fuso and Yamashiro, and 2 of the Issei class, Issei and Hyuga, both of which were armed with 12 14-inch guns. In addition, Japan had also commissioned the battleship Nagato in 1920. Armed with the powerful new 16-inch gun, she was the most powerful battleship in the world at the time of completion. This new battle fleet would conduct fleet maneuvers around Japan to train them in working homogeneously together and be able to effectively win any battle that they would have to fight. Theoretically, anyway. During one of these training maneuvers, held in February 1922, whilst maneuvering, Kirishima collided with the destroyer Fuji, although neither ship sustained much damage in the incident. Kirishima and the battle fleet would again be deployed in September 1923, this time not for fleet maneuvers, but to provide aid to Japanese civilians after Japan was struck by the Great Kanto earthquake. She continued in this role until the end of September, when she was placed in reserve 3 months later. At this point, she was considered somewhat outdated, and there was no need to keep her in active service. Japan had already launched 2 new battlecruisers of the Amagi class, both of which were armed with 16-inch guns. These ships far surpassed the ships of the Kongo class, and once they were commissioned, Kirishima would no longer be anywhere near the most powerful battlecruiser wielded by Japan, although granted she would still be an effective combat unit. However, as fate would have it, this was simply not meant to be. By 1922, it became obvious that the world was on the verge of a massive three-way naval arms race. The three victors of World War I, Japan, Great Britain, and the United States, were all eager to expand their navy as much as they possibly could, and they were starting to see each other as a threat. As a result, each of them began designing and then building new classes of powerful capital ships, all of which were hopefully more powerful than any ship that had come before it. The US and Japan in particular had already entered the preliminary stages of the arms race, with Japan commissioning the battleship Nagato in 1920, then followed by the commissioning of USS Colorado a year later. Both ships were equipped with a powerful main battery of 8 16-inch guns, which made them the most powerful ships in commission for any navy at the time. As the arms race continued to progress, it became evident that something had to be done before it could progress any further. The last time a naval arms race like this had occurred, it had been between Britain and Germany, and the result had been the First World War, a repeat of which was on nobody's bucket list. In addition, the construction of capital ships was incredibly expensive, and an arms race would no doubt put serious economic strain on all countries involved. As a result, on November 21st, 1921, a conference involving most of the world's leading naval powers was held in Washington, D.C., and after a few days of negotiations, it would result in what would come to be known as the Washington Naval Treaty. In short, the treaty placed a ban on capital ship construction for all signatory countries, and restricted the amount of tonnage each country was allowed to use for further warship construction. An allocated ratio of 5 to 5 to 3 was given to the United States, Britain, and Japan, respectively. Despite arguably getting the short end of the stick, Japan would end up signing the treaty, both to keep on good relations with the United States and to prevent the country going bankrupt in further capital ship construction. However, this meant that until 1936, the year which the treaty expired, Japan could neither lay down nor complete any battleships, either in design phase or already under construction, with the exception of the Nagato-class battleship Mutsu, which was deemed to already be too near completion to be scrapped. However, for the incomplete battleships of the Tosa and Kii classes, which even now were already being built and in some cases launched, they would never see the light of day. This meant that Japan had no choice but to make do with the old ships in their battle fleet, which, outside of the dreadnought battleship Setsu, had remained largely untouched by the treaty. However, more importantly for this story, none of the battlecruisers of the Amagi class would ever be completed in their intended form, although one would be converted to an aircraft carrier. Now, the 4 old ships of the Kongo class would have to continue to carry their weight as the only remaining battlecruisers in Japan's arsenal. The Washington Naval Treaty came into effect on August 17, 1923, and Japan's plans of naval expansion were effectively put in check. Now stripped of their ability to construct new capital ships, there were no prospects of Japan expanding their battle fleet, and like the rest of the world, they would have to make do with the ships that were still in their arsenal. Although outdated, the Kongo class still had an important role to play in Japan's battle fleet, and it was recognized as such. Therefore, in place of new battlecruiser construction, the Imperial Navy instead opted to heavily upgrade the ships of the Kongo class, to hopefully make them as competitive and modern as absolutely possible. Therefore, alongside the fleet exercises and occasional controls that had become a staple of interwar life in Japan's battle fleet, Kirishima and her sisters would start to undergo massive reconstructions. Starting in 1926, Kirishima was placed in reserve as she began to undergo preparations for her first major reconstruction. After the completion of a similar modernization on her sister Hiei, work on Kirishima would begin in early 1927. Over the course of 3 years, dockyard workers toiled away to make the old battlecruiser into a frontline combat unit. During the reconstruction, Kirishima would receive a thorough upgrade to her torpedo protection system, and similar to the refits seen on other capital ships, large torpedo bulges were added on either side of the ship in order to reduce the damage dealt by a torpedo. Additionally, since they were void spaces, it was also possible to manually flood the bulges to reduce a ship's list, a tactic that the Japanese were particularly fond of. During the refit, Kirishima's belt armor was also strengthened over her magazines in order to provide better protection against enemy fire, with the upgrade also improving the armor over her machinery spaces. In addition, Kirishima's old coal-fired boilers were judged to be obsolete by this point, and since coal-fired boilers had been dropped a long time ago in favor of oil-fired models, Kirishima's boilers were replaced with 10 modern Kampon boilers, which were capable of running on both coal and oil, serving the added bonus of increasing her speed from 27 to 29 knots. The last of the underwater changes to the ship involved the removal of 4 of her submerged torpedo tubes, which had been judged as useless in a modern naval engagement. However, the biggest visual change to the battlecruiser was the complete reconstruction of her forward tripod mast, which was stripped down and then transformed into what would become later known as a pagoda mast due to its resemblance to that particular style of tower. The pagoda mast was effectively just a more useful version of the tripod, as instead of just featuring 3 mostly useless rods, the pagoda was built with multiple tiered levels, with each one having a specific use. It also ended up being a very convenient spot to install searchlights, which would serve to augment Kirishima's ability to fight at night, which would possibly be of some use if she ever got into a night battle. That's called foreshadowing. Despite looking rather stupid, the pagoda mast actually proved to be highly successful, and it became a staple in almost all Japanese capital ships, with some of them, like the one on the battleship Fuso, reaching a staggering 130 feet tall. Remarkably, even masts of this size resulted in almost no stability issues, although I doubt anyone would want to stand on the top level in rough seas. Kirishima came out of her refit in April 1930, looking and probably feeling like an entirely different ship, which in a sense, she kind of was. She now formed part of a new and upgraded combined fleet, at a convenient time considering that at the moment, every capital ship counted. Only 6 days after her reconstruction had been completed, on April 22, 1930, Emperor Hirohito put even more pressure on the Japanese Navy by signing his name on the London Naval Treaty, which again put limitations on ship construction for the Imperial Navy, this time until 1937. A clause in this new treaty again forced Japan to scrap or disarm even more of their warships, most notably Kirishima's sister Hiei, which was stripped of its armor and guns and reduced to such mundane tasks as training cadets and ferrying around the Emperor. Despite all of this, it would still be a few years before Kirishima did anything, for the simple fact that in the interwar, there wasn't anything for her to do, something that was reflected in the next 2 years of her life, where the only thing of note was a quick refit in October that gave her the ability to launch reconnaissance seaplanes. In April 1932, after a quick patrol off China with her sister Haruna, Kirishima was placed in reserve for the 3rd time in her career. There she would remain until 1933, when the pace of her life started to kick up again. For those of you watching this video who know your history dates a little better than I do, I'm sure you've probably realized that I've skipped over something rather important, that being Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The reason that I've so far neglected to mention it is because it didn't start to majorly affect Japan's navy until 1933, at which point Kirishima was still in reserve. It was on the 15th of February 1933 when the League of Nations agreed that Japan violated Chinese sovereignty by invading Manchuria. Shocker, I know, but what happened after this would have a massive impact on the Imperial Navy. After finding out what the League thought about their invasion, Japan did something not entirely unexpected and left the League of Nations the very same day, which was then followed up by a prompt withdrawal from the Washington and London naval treaties, which meant that the IJN could now do whatever the hell they wanted. Yeah. Anyway, Japan wasn't going to start building any super battleships for another few years at the very least, and in the interim, it was decided that the best course of action was to again upgrade the Congos, this time to make them more suitable for the mission of carrier escort. Honestly, if there's anything that shows just how fast warships could become obsolete, it would be the fact that it had only been 4 years since Kirishima's last refit had been completed. Nevertheless, the old battlecruiser would begin her refit in November 1934, when she was dry docked at the Sasebo Naval Arsenal. For the next 2 years, Kirishima would receive multiple large upgrades, the first of which involved the replacement of her mixed-firing boilers with strictly oil-fired ones, the replacement of her old turbines, and the lengthening of her stern by 26 feet, all of which would conspire to increase her speed to 30.5 knots, which made her one of the fastest capital ships in the world. Her anti-aircraft armament also received an extensive upgrade, with her old 3-inch weapons being torn out and replaced with modern 5-inch dual-purpose guns, which, of course, could also be used against surface targets if the need arose. Consideration was also given to her main and secondary batteries, which both had their elevation increased to allow them to fire as far as 38,000 yards. Ordinarily, ships of Kirishima's age wouldn't actually be able to have good enough fire control to hit a target at that distance. But during the refit, Kirishima was also fitted with a catapult and crane, which gave her the ability to operate an air group of 3 floatplanes, which could be launched during a gun battle to relay targeting data back to the ship, and thus increase the accuracy of her main battery. Kirishima's armor scheme was also extensively upgraded, with her belt armor changed to a uniform thickness of 8 inches. In addition, 4 inches of steel were added to parts of the deck armor, and the armor on her gun turrets was strengthened to a full 10 inches.
To round off the refit, her pagoda mast was strengthened for the fitting of new gun directors, and Kirishima's final 4 torpedo tubes were removed, since battle ranges had increased to a point where they would be completely useless in any realistic scenario. Kirishima would complete her refit and leave the confines of her dry dock in June of 1936, and emerge into a world where her services might actually soon be required. Tensions with China were fast on the rise, and the question of proper war had changed from an if to a when. In a somewhat stark reflection of these circumstances, Kirishima would only have to wait 1 month before she would again take up the familiar duty of patrolling off of China, this time accompanied by the battleship Fuso. A year or so later, in April 1937, she would make a trip to the Chinese port of Tsingtao, this time accompanied by her sister Haruna and the battleships Hyuga, Nagato, and Mutsu, along with multiple detachments of cruisers and destroyers. This was the last taste of peace that Kirishima would ever experience. 4 months later, in July 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident set light to the Second Sino-Japanese War. As units of the Imperial Army made moves against the Chinese, the men of the battlecruiser Kirishima began making preparations to take their ship to war. On the 20th of August 1937, Kirishima would embark on her first hostile deployment since the end of the Great War. Departing from the port of Atsuta in company with Haruna, Kirishima embarked on a transport run to the Shangxi Islands off the coast of China. On board, she carried the 1st Battalion of the 68th Infantry Regiment and 2 other battalions of the 3rd Infantry Division, both designated for service on the Chinese front. On the 22nd, while still en route to the drop-off point, the battlecruiser fulfilled a secondary mission. Using her complement of 3 floatplanes, Kirishima launched 2 separate bombing strikes against targets in the area of Shanghai, a rare moment where a service warship became the perpetrator of an aerial bombardment. Arriving at the Shangxi Islands later that day, Kirishima offloaded her troops to the cruiser Natori and the destroyer Hashimoto before steaming back for Japan. The next day, on the 23rd, she again made use of her floatplane against Shanghai, although this time their purpose was only reconnaissance and not a bombing mission. Making port at Sasebo a day later, Kirishima's crew and captain were given a few days spare time to reflect on their deployment. Even though she hadn't fired a single one of her guns, her floatplanes had still seen action in Shanghai, and having incurred absolutely no losses, there was no doubt in their minds that the deployment had been a success, and in their opinion, it would not be long before she went out for another one. As it would turn out, they would be all too correct. For the next 4 years, that's all that she would do. The Sino-Japanese War gave the Japanese battle fleet the first chance to stretch its legs that it had had in a long time, and although none of them ever did anything more exciting than bomb targets with their floatplanes, it was still a small taste of what wartime operations would look like. And a good thing too, since war with the US and Great Britain was every day looking more and more like a legitimate threat, which, to be fair, it absolutely was. This tension would actually end up being reflected during one of the battle fleet's larger deployments to China. Suffice to say, the Japanese were not the only ones operating warships in Chinese waters at this time. British and American warships were as well, and one of these warships happened to get a bit of a cheeky idea. In October 1938, the British Admiralty in London received a report that a large Japanese battle fleet was anchored in Amoy. This report actually turned out to be more or less correct, and based on already known data of Japanese ships operating in the area, the British deduced that the fleet contained the battleships Kongo, Kirishima, Fuso, Hyuga, Ise, Mutsu, and Nagato, along with a very respectable amount of cruisers and destroyers as escort. The British, for their part, had the light cruiser Birmingham stationed in the China area, and this led to the development of what I can only describe as a very British idea. On the 21st of October, Birmingham began creeping towards the entrance of Amoy Harbor, where the Japanese fleet was lying at anchor. Her mission was to make a dash into the harbor and take photographs of as many of the Japanese ships as possible, in order to deduce what sort of equipment they had on board. As many Japanese warships had never been properly photographed before, any photos that could be taken would be invaluable in the creation of recognition manuals, or simply deducing how advanced Japanese technology was at the time. Birmingham entered the harbor with every available man holding a camera or a sketchbook. They began taking pictures of the numerous Japanese warships surrounding them, whose pagoda masts towered over their smaller warship. The Japanese, for their part, could do nothing but throw tarps over their equipment and pray that the British didn't get anything. After sitting around for a little bit, Birmingham withdrew from the harbor, and somebody on Kirishima received permission to launch a float plane which began following her. As the British ship withdrew, the plane's observer, probably more out of spite than anything, snapped a few pictures back at her before returning to Kirishima. As for what information the British got out of this, It's hard to say, although I did find a few pictures that she took of Kirishima, which you can see on screen right now. Hey, yeah, so it's me from the future. So as it would turn out, these photos were not taken by Birmingham. These were actually taken by USS Pillsbury in 1938. Now, granted, these are of Kirishima in Amoy, but they're not, these are not the photos taken by Birmingham. I thought they were. I double-checked while editing the video. They're not. So, they're cool photos, but just keep that in mind. I was wrong by that. Sorry. Despite serving around China all the way up until February 1941, the encounter with Birmingham would prove to be the last notable thing during her deployment, and with war clouds beginning to swell, she would be recalled to Japan in early March of 1941. And come November of that same year, Kirishima and the combined fleet would begin to prepare for conflict with the United States. The day is November 26, 1941. It was on this day that the Japanese Navy would embark on one of the most audacious naval operations ever undertaken. Early that morning, the strongest portion of the Japanese naval air arm would depart from the home islands and set out for the open ocean. The aircraft carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zoikaku all quietly slipped their moorings and set out to sea. Following them closely was a powerful escort force. Steaming on the flanks of the aircraft carriers were the battleships Kirishima and Hiei, followed by the cruisers Tone, Chikuma, and Abukuma. Once in formation, the force began its journey. It would be 11 days before it reached its destination. Under the command of Vice Admiral Choichi Nagumo, this carrier fleet, known as the Kido Butai, was the largest and most well-trained contingent of naval air power that had ever been put to sea. Their target was the US Navy base of Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. According to operational orders, the fleet would sail to Hawaii and deliver a surprise aerial attack on the ships of the US Pacific Fleet, which, having caught the Americans off guard, was expected to deliver a crushing blow. If everything went to plan, the Japanese Navy would have complete naval control of the Pacific Ocean. December 7th, 1941, 0630 Hawaiian time. Kirishima, Hiei, and the ships of the 8th Cruiser Division launched their complement of floatplanes to patrol around the Kido Butai. No enemy is sighted. All is safe for the Japanese. On board every ship in the formation, there is a feeling of anticipation for what is to come. Still, there is no fear, and every ship continues sailing, sailors performing their routines almost as if it is any other day. For the men on the aircraft carriers, now is a day that has long been awaited and trained for, and for many of the crew, confidence cannot help but prevail. At 0749, with the famous Z flag from the Battle of Tsushima proudly flying from her mast, the radio room aboard the flagship Akagi transmits the long-awaited message to begin the attack. Reading simply as Tora, 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 this message would announce the start of Japan's proper entry into the Second World War. With the message gone out, all 6 veteran carriers of the Kido Butai begin putting their planes into the sky. 166 aircraft slowly begin making their way off of the flight decks and orbiting above the formation of ships hundreds of feet below them. Eventually forming up in the air, the planes began making their way toward Pearl Harbor, which upon their arrival at 0755 was decimated by a cacophony of bombs and torpedoes. The US airbase at Hickam Field was destroyed by aircraft from Zoikaku and Shokaku, while the rest of the aircraft continued on to the main targets. Torpedo bombers from the Soryu struck the target ship Utah with 2 torpedoes, quickly capsizing her and forcing her to come to rest on the bottom of the harbor. From there, the Japanese attack rained down on Battleship Row. The USS Arizona had her main magazine detonated by a bomb from Hiryu, whilst the battleships Oklahoma and West Virginia were struck by torpedoes from Akagi and Kaga, quickly sinking them both. At 0840, the carriers launched their second and last strike of 171 aircraft. Retiring back to their carriers at 0945, having done little more damage to the US base, Vice Admiral Nagumo decided that the Japanese had pushed their luck for the day, and the Kido Butai retired back toward Japanese waters. Over the course of the attacks, the Japanese naval airmen sank the battleships Oklahoma, California, Nevada, West Virginia, and Arizona, and damaged nearly every other capital ship present at the time of attack. Now, this was incredibly severe damage to the US fleet, but there was one question that was almost immediately raised by Japanese high command. Where in God's name were the American carriers? After all, the disabling of the carrier fleet was one of, if not the most important mission objective, and they simply were not present. All that the Japanese had found in their place was the target ship Utah, which of course had been promptly sunk, but still, if the US carriers were still online and functioning, which, let's be honest, they clearly were, then they might actually pose a very serious threat to further operations by the Imperial Navy. To compound this failure, it was soon realized that the Japanese government had somehow failed to actually declare war on the United States until almost 30 minutes after the attack had already taken place. And adding on with the nature of the surprise attack, this was bound to piss off the Americans. And no doubt in that regard, it 100% succeeded. But regardless, Japan had still gotten something for the attack, and although it was definitely nowhere near perfect, the result was still debatably better than if they hadn't acted. Kirishima, for her part, hadn't taken a particularly active role in the attack itself, and as a result, the only thing of note with her would end up being that she got swamped by a bunch of waves and ended up receiving damage because of it. However, the attack on Pearl set something of a standard for the old battlecruiser, and it would end up serving as the first of many times that Kirishima would put herself to use during the war as a carrier escort. Pearl Harbor would be her only action for 1941, but come January 1942, she would again see continued service escorting the 6 carriers of the Kido Butai, providing AA cover for their strikes on Rabaul on the 17th, and then again sortying with them on the 1st of February to look for the American carriers that had been reported to be raiding the Marshall and Gilbert Islands. Despite a good bit of searching on the Japanese part, by the time they got there the Americans had long since left the crime scene, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Nothing could be done to engage them that day, and the Japanese withdrew from the area. It was a bitter pill to swallow. Every day the American carriers were still around in the Pacific was another day where the Japanese war effort was at a significant threat, and something desperately needed to be done about it, and quickly. Nevertheless, if the American carriers refused to show their faces, then they could not be drawn into battle, and after the Marshall Gilbert's raid was over, it would be impossible to destroy the Americans until they again showed their face. It was a similar pattern to how the British and German battle fleets had operated back in the First World War. But in the Japanese case, unlike their British counterparts, they had other things to do than just wait until the American carriers went in for another raid. The Kido Butai had a number of important assignments that had to be fulfilled, and none of them could really be ignored. At the end of the day, the Japanese had time to destroy the Americans, and they were already working on a magnificent and absolutely impeccable plan to do it. There is no foreshadowing in that sentence whatsoever. Either way, until that plan came to fruition, for the time being, the Japanese contented themselves with a strike on Port Darwin in Australia. And although it was being conducted with only 4 carriers, less the 5th Carrier Division, and without escort from Battleship Division 3, who were off doing fuck knows what, it still ended up being a success, and almost immediately afterward, the Japanese began gearing up for another major operation. Turning to the land side of the Pacific War for a minute, it's found that the stunning victories won by the Japanese Navy have been done almost twofold by the IJA. So far in the war, they had managed to put the American defenders of the Philippines on the back foot, induce the largest British surrender in history when Singapore fell, and capture a significant portion of the Dutch East Indies, which was now only held together by the Allied forces, still relentlessly fighting on the island of Java. Not to mention, they did all this with a good few war crimes sprinkled throughout. Good old IJA, am I right? Anyway, it was against this backdrop that the Japanese decided to deploy the Kido Butai to the Dutch East Indies, where we would hopefully be able to eradicate what remained of the ABDA naval forces still operating in the area, and also launch strikes against key positions on Java. Sortying on the 25th of February 1942, the Kido Butai made its way toward the Dutch East Indies, with Hiei and Kirishima dutifully following in their rear. Thus far, the 2 Japanese battle wagons had seen no action apart from anti-aircraft screening for the aircraft carriers, but by virtue of luck, this mission would be very different, and Kirishima, for her part, would begin to earn her reputation as the gunfighter of the Japanese Navy. February 1942. As the Japanese carriers make their way toward the Dutch East Indies, 2 American destroyers slip out of the port of Cilacap on the island of Java. They are 2 outdated Clemson-class destroyers, USS Whipple and USS Edsel. Both had been built and designed in the midst of the First World War, and since then they had hardly received anything like a proper refit, and they were serving on the front lines only out of necessity. Still, despite being outdated, the Clemson class had still proven combat effective at engagements at the Java Sea and the Badung Strait, where they had dueled with much more modern Japanese opponents. However, the mission for these two destroyers was far more bland compared to their class's previous assignments. They had been tasked with escorting the old seaplane tender USS Langley to Cilacap, where she would deliver 32 P-40 fighters to the hard-pressed forces on Java. The Langley, for her part, had been built as the collier Jupiter during the First World War, but was converted into an aircraft carrier in 1920, thus becoming the first of her kind in operation with the US Navy. She provided valuable experience for the US in carrier operations until her conversion to a seaplane tender in 1936. Due to the fact that she was still equipped with half of her old flight deck, she was pressed into service as an aircraft transport at the start of the Pacific War, since, unlike other seaplane tenders, she was capable of transporting fully completed aircraft on what remained of her flight deck. This was the mission that she was fulfilling now, and having recently been detached from the protection of her convoy to proceed to Cilacap independently, she needed an escort. And of course, this came in the form of the two destroyers, which were now beginning to make headway to Langley's position. In the early hours of the 27th of February, the destroyers made contact with the carrier and began forming up around her. To the men on board the ships, it must have been quite a sight. 3 of the oldest ships in the US Navy operating together, just like they would have 20 years earlier during the interwar. However, this was no longer peacetime, and the ships were underway on a vitally important mission, one that the enemy was bound to oppose. That same morning, the convoy was overflown by a Japanese reconnaissance aircraft that dutifully reported their location back to the headquarters. Receiving the message of an enemy formation en route to Java, the as of yet undetected Kido Butai began racing towards Langley's location, and started making preparations to launch an attack. However, Japanese airfields in the Dutch East Indies were more than prepared to deal with them all by themselves. At 11:40, about 75 nautical miles away from port, Langley came under air attack. 16 G4M Betty bombers and 15 A6M Zero fighters flying from an airfield on Bali began putting Langley under a concentrated level bombing attack. As Langley's anti-aircraft gunners put up a fierce barrage, the old ship began swerving to avoid the carpet of bombs now descending her way. She skillfully avoided the first 2 passes by the level bombers with nothing more than mild splinter damage from near misses. The Japanese, realizing that their attack pattern wasn't working, changed their tactics on the 3rd pass. The Betty bombers again flew over their target, dropping their bombs in such a way that they bracketed every direction Langley could turn. Turning hard to port in a desperate attempt to avoid the inevitable, Langley was struck by 4 bombs which did catastrophic damage. With burning P-40s ignited on deck and a 10-foot hole ripped open in her starboard hull, the Japanese left the scene, leaving the stricken ship with her rudder jammed and listing 10 degrees to port. Damage Control did the best they could to stabilize the crippled ship, but the damage was incredibly severe. Burning aircraft were cast off of the flight deck, leaving behind black scorch marks where they once stood. With her cargo dumped overboard and her engine room knocked out of action, Langley lay useless and dead in the water. At 13:32, the surviving crew members were ordered to abandon ship and to transfer to the 2 undamaged destroyers. After taking on board 485 survivors between them, the 2 destroyers cast away from the crippled ship and began the agonizing process of scuttling her. 9 4-inch shells and 2 torpedoes slammed into Langley's hull at 14:29. The once proud ship descended below the ocean surface, taking with her all of her desperately needed cargo and the lives of 16 US sailors. The 2 US destroyers now found themselves in something of a quandary. Loaded to the brim with survivors from the Langley, they were no longer fit for any sort of action and needed to dump them as soon as possible. As such, they quickly changed course to the nearby Christmas Island. The following day, on the 28th, the 2 destroyers rendezvoused with the oiler USS Pecos off Flying Fish Cove, and in between frequent Japanese air raids, unloaded all of Langley's survivors on board the oiler. On the 1st of March, Whipple set out for the Cocos Islands as escort for the tanker Belida, leaving Edsel behind at Christmas Island. USS Pecos, now loaded with survivors not just from the Langley, but also from the recently sunk destroyer Stuart and the heavy cruiser Houston, was ordered to abandon the East Indies and sail to Australia. Edsel, for her part, was ordered to return to Cilacap, carrying 38 Air Force pilots that had been aboard Langley by the time that she sank. Even without their planes, these pilots would still be of much use. Following orders, she left Christmas Island on the 28th of February, bound for the island of Java. However, only a day later, these orders were countermanded. A general order had gone out for all US warships to evacuate Java and head for a rendezvous point to the south, a point that, unbeknownst to High Command, was compromised by the still undetected Kido Butai. Vice Admiral Choichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi, overlooking the other 3 aircraft carriers present in the Kido Butai. So far, since the deployment to the East Indies had begun, there had been very little action for the ships in his formation. Having called off the strike on USS Langley after hearing of her destruction, the Japanese had proceeded in silence, and, as of yet, almost complete secrecy. Java had finally fallen to the IJA on the 1st of March, and with that victory, targets began to spring up. Earlier that morning, a floatplane from Kirishima had bombed a fleeing Allied merchant ship that was trying to escape to Australia. Although the ship had gotten away unscathed, it was hoped that its presence was a sign of better targets to come. However, Nagumo's carriers had found nothing suitable for a strike until later that same afternoon, when a search plane flying from the aircraft carrier Soryu spotted a ship that appeared to be heading to Australia. Although not identified by the Japanese until later, this was the oiler Pecos, still loaded with survivors from the Langley. Lookouts aboard the Pecos spotted the Japanese aircraft and identified it due to a very distinguishing feature: non-retractable landing gear. This was clearly a Val dive bomber, and unlike other aircraft that had attacked Allied ships around Java, up to this point, Vals had only flown from Japanese aircraft carriers. The discovery of one so close to the East Indies could mean only one thing. The dreaded Kido Butai was operating in the area, and Pecos was in for one hell of a fight. As she'd been detected, and with no way to defend herself other than with anti-aircraft fire, it was assumed by all aboard that Pecos would be lost, and immediately she began broadcasting distress signals. Soryu's Val broadcasted a sighting report back to Nagumo, who decided that the Kido Butai would not let the ship get away. Over the next few hours, 3 strikes were launched from Nagumo's carriers. With Pecos constantly broadcasting for help like a wounded animal, Kido Butai's expert pilots planted 5 bombs onto the deck of the oiler. At 1500, Pecos' last distress signal was sent out, and 10 minutes later, she sank beneath the waves. 400 men, including survivors from Langley, went down with the ship. Only 232 were rescued by the destroyer Whipple, which, having heard the distress calls, arrived on the scene nearly 4 hours after the attack. With a victory finally in hand, Nagumo's 4 carriers recovered their strikes on Pecos and continued steaming onward looking for more targets, and thought little more about what had just gone down. However, nearly 40 minutes after the sinking of Pecos, a Val dive bomber from Akagi, likely returning from the attack on Pecos itself, spotted a surface contact in the distance. It was about 16 miles away from the carriers and around 250 miles southeast of Christmas Island. Upon closer examination, the contact appeared to be an American ship, distinguished by 4 prominent funnels amidships. The Japanese erroneously reported her as the Omaha-class cruiser USS Marblehead, a ship long coveted by the Japanese for proving stupidly difficult to sink. Nagumo, ecstatic at such a prize being spotted, but frankly pissed that the ship was allowed to close to within only 16 miles of his carriers, ordered a portion of his screening force to intercept. The cruisers Tone and Chikuma broke away from the Kido Butai and made full speed toward the cruiser's reported location. Accompanying them were the 2 heavy hitters of the Japanese formation. Steaming alongside the cruisers was the battlecruiser Hiei, her gun crews working frantically to prepare for action. Mirroring her sister on the other side of the 2 cruisers came the Kirishima, her 14-inch guns searching for a lock on the American ship. However, there was a bit of a problem. The ship that the Japanese had in their sights was not the USS Marblehead, but was in fact the USS Edsel. Having heard the distress signals from their sinking Pecos, Edsel had immediately changed her heading and steered directly toward her last known location, only to end up almost directly alongside the Kido Butai. She was only around 24 miles from the last known position of Pecos when all of a sudden, 8-inch shell splashes began raining down around the destroyer. Chikuma opened fire first at 1603, followed 15 minutes later by Kirishima and Hiei. Straddled by shells coming from nearly 30,000 yards away, Captain Joshua Nix aboard Edsel ordered the immediate deployment of a smokescreen, and also began constant and rapid maneuvering in order to confuse the Japanese gunners. With hundreds of shells raining down around their target and yet still no hits being obtained, the Japanese rightly started to become frustrated with their poor gunnery. Hiei launched her entire complement of floatplanes in an attempt to get more accurate targeting data back to her gunners, but still all of her shots missed. At the range they were firing at, it would take nearly 30 seconds after firing for the shots to land, and in that time, the nimble destroyer could easily have maneuvered far enough to throw off the gunner's aim entirely. 2 minutes after opening fire, Hiei sent the signal "All forces charge" to the other ships in the formation, more or less ordering a general attack on the small destroyer. The two Japanese battleships made speed in an attempt to encircle the destroyer from both sides, and hopefully bring their aft and secondary batteries to bear. However, the destroyer's movements continued to throw off the Japanese gunners, and her smokescreen had managed to shield her from Tone's lookouts for almost 40 minutes. However, the battleships continued firing, and the destroyer's constant movements had allowed the range to continue to close down since the battle started. Through all this time, the Japanese crew members and officers began to question if the ship they were firing at was actually the USS Marblehead. When Tone's gunners finally made visual contact with the American ship, they identified her correctly as a Clemson-class destroyer, although this information was of very little use at this point to the Japanese. At 1639, Rear Admiral Mikawa orders his battleships to flank speed, so that they might close the range and finally begin doing some damage. Captain Nix aboard Edsel notices the change in speed and mind-bogglingly decides that this is the right time for a counterattack. In a magnificent display of bravery, orders are barked out for Edsel to turn straight toward the Japanese and counterattack with her torpedoes. As the range to the Japanese ships closes to only 10,000 yards, Edsel's gunners train their 4-inch guns on the Japanese ships and begin firing. Without a modern fire control system aboard, Edsel cannot hope to mimic the accuracy that other American destroyer charges would exhibit later in the war, but her counterattack takes the Japanese by surprise. Completing her 180-degree turn to starboard, Edsel launches a spread of 6 torpedoes from her torpedo launchers, before following the tracks toward the Japanese line, continuing to fire off her 4-inch guns. Either way, she ends up mimicking the Japanese and scoring no hits, but shocked crew members aboard Chikuma watch as Edsel's 6 torpedoes pass dangerously close to their ship before just skidding on behind them. At 16:55, as dusk begins to approach, the Japanese check their fire without having scored a single hit, despite having fired over 1,000 rounds at the destroyer. Her rapid maneuvering and skillful dodging of the Japanese shells causes some Japanese officers to refer to her as the Dancing Mouse. As news of the battleship's failure begins to reach Vice Admiral Nagumo, he decides that Japanese gunnery is only going to get worse once darkness comes, and that he'd rather keep Kido Butai's string of victories completely intact. As night steadily drew closer, he ordered Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu to launch dive bombers, which he believed will be able to do what the surface forces could not. Unfortunately for the Americans, his judgment was absolutely correct. Between 1657 and 1720, multiple 500-pound bombs were skillfully placed on the deck of the old destroyer, igniting fires and shattering her steering, whilst near misses pop open rivets on her hull, knocked out her engine rooms, and left her dead in the water. As the aircraft retreated back to their carriers so they could land before sunset, the Japanese surface forces closed to within only a few hundred yards of the crippled destroyer. As the Japanese again open fire on the stationary target, a cameraman on Tone begins recording the Edsel's destruction. It is the footage you are seeing on screen right now. Finally, at 1731, the crippled Edsel capsized amid towering shell splashes, turning turtle like a beached whale before finally slipping under the waters of the Indian Ocean. After hours of shooting, the Japanese could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The Japanese picked up multiple survivors from the American destroyer before withdrawing back to their picket stations off the flanks of the Kido Butai. Aboard Kirishima, gunners would spend the night trying to blow off some steam from their ridiculously bad shooting. After-action reports later drawn up by the Japanese would rightfully describe the action as an absolute fiasco. Over 1,300 shells had been fired against the destroyer, with likely no more than 2 hits being scored before the carrier's intervention, and even after that, only a few more shells had made contact. After this engagement, the IJN significantly revised their doctrine for attacking destroyers with battleships, and also used it as a training guide for how not to attack a destroyer. From the start of the action to its end, Kirishima had fired 87 14-inch and 62 6-inch shells, likely without scoring any hits, a number that is more testament to the skill of Edsel's captain than a lack of training of Japanese gun crews. The loss of Edsel coincided with the Battle of the Sunda Strait, where Japanese cruisers and aircraft sank the cruisers USS Houston, HMAS Perth, and the Dutch destroyer Evertsen. Between this battle and the action off Christmas Island, the remnants of the Abda Navy were almost completely eradicated, with these ships being sunk the same day that Java finally fell to the IJA. With only a small handful of Allied warships making their escape to Australia, and none of them easy to find or detect, Nagumo elected to withdraw the Kido Butai from the area and return to Staring Bay in Indonesia, where after nearly 5 months of continued operations, their crew could finally get some rest. The Dutch East Indies had been neutralized, and for the members of Kirishima's crew, it must have seemed that there would be no need for another combat voyage for a long time to come. But they could not have been more wrong. The war was, after all, still heated, and it would be only days into their respite when the services of the Kido Butai would again be needed, and this time as the backbone of another major operation. This one would turn out to be one of the most ambitious operations the Kido Butai had yet attempted. Nagumo's carriers were going to carry out another surprise attack on the enemy, but this time not against the Americans. This time, they were going to fight the British. Hey, what's up all? Yeah, it's me again, and yes, I am playing Task Force 1942. It's a good game, sue me. Anyway, it would seem as if you finished this video, and that means one of two things. Either you fell asleep with autoplay on, or you genuinely enjoyed this video, and if it was the latter, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and drop a quick like on this video. This is the first video that I've uploaded, and it would help out the channel an absolute ton. On that note, I'd also like to give a quick shout out to some other small naval YouTubers who are in the scene right now. If you enjoyed this video, you'll 100% enjoy them as well, so maybe when you've got some free time, go ahead check them out. I'm sure that they'd really appreciate it. Anyway, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, cheers all.